We all know that the new MacBook Pros come with a high impedance headphone jack, as Apple calls it. So we have probably the most popular high impedance headphone, the HD6XX. I'm going to be seeing if the MacBook Pro headphone amplifier is one, enough, and two, I'm also going to be comparing it against a number of other DAC amps to see how much higher in price you have to go before it becomes worth it to get one for the HD6XX. And then I'm going to compare the amps along the way. Now, I don't know how long they're going to be on sale, but as of this video, they should be on sale for about $199. So that's close to $100 off what they typically go for. So if you are going to snag them up for the holidays, I think now's the time. Now, as it stands right now, in my personal opinion, the sound of the MacBook Pro as a built-in amplifier actually sounds really, really good. This does not seem to share the generic problems that most other built-in amplifiers seem to have, with a lot of laptops being either a noise floor. There's no noise floor on this really. A lot of times you'll see this reduction in bass or the upper treble response, and there doesn't seem to be that. It seems quite fulfilled in that region. It seems to have really good dynamic range, a complete frequency response, no negative traits that are obvious and really jump out to me or anybody that I've talked to. So it seems like a total win for a laptop amplifier that's just kind of a bonus on top of a really good package already. Now, when it comes to the 6XX, this is a 300 ohm headphone that does require a lot of power. There are lots of amplifiers and built-ins that cannot power this in terms of volume output alone, not to mention the sound quality of it after powering it sufficiently. Now, with the laptop here, I am able to power this to moderate listening levels, which is where I personally listen. I don't like to listen very, very loud, but I'm able to get there with only 3/4 of the volume being used, which is very impressive for this headphone. And it's good to see that users who listen a little bit louder than I do are also going to be able to have headroom for them as well. Now, the first step for me was actually the Apple dongle. I wanted to know if it was better to use a phone and an Apple dongle instead of the laptop's output. And right away you get shut down because it's simply not enough power. This is what I was talking about with a lot of built-in stuff. It simply did not get loud enough to really judge the sound characteristics for what I consider to be like a good listening level. Also, even though it is a little bit harder to judge at quieter volumes, it did seem to me to have a little bit of a bass roll off and a little bit of a treble roll off, which for this headphone, I don't think is what you want. So for right now, the MacBook Pro's output is a lot better. Next up was the Schiit Hel. This thing costs about $200, so it's quite a bit up in price. But the reason why I wanted to include this one was because even though it's $200, it's not purely a headphone amplifier. I would say that, you know, it's kind of like half of a headphone amplifier and half of an audio interface. Right away, you will notice that the Hel definitely has a lot more power at its disposal, though that's going to be a common occurrence here compared to basically every other amp from this point forward. But I don't think that it's going to matter for this headphone, mostly because the output volume seems to be sufficient on the Mac already. Having a load of extra power and tons of extra headroom, I don't think is a real benefit here. The sound here is honestly very, very similar, but I think would give the edge to the MacBook Pro, mostly because the Hel has a couple of sound characteristics that I don't find to be the best and don't seem to benefit the 6XX that much. The Hel has upper mid-range characteristics that seem a tiny bit shouty and a tiny bit glary, and I don't love that representation in general, but especially on the 6XX. It doesn't really need a boost in the mid-range. It needs boosts in other regions, though reference amplifiers shouldn't be boosting really. But as it stands right now, I think that was an unpleasant component of the Hel. They also had pretty equivalent bass response for the 6XX, and the imaging and soundstage seemed to be just about as three-dimensional on both, though it is notable that I felt like in the Hel review, the Hel did collapse the soundstage a tiny bit, so that is something I'm going to be paying attention to in the future. For the 6XX specifically, I would not recommend purchasing the Hel to get a better audio experience over the MacBook Pro. Okay, then I opted for a different type of headphone amplifier. This is a tiny dongle called the Moon River 2. I like this little amplifier a lot, and I thought I'd see how they compare. This is a $200 value, same with the Hel, but the 3.5mm has just about the same amount of power as the MacBook Pro output does for volume output. At least I was able to get about 3/4 of the way up for both before I hit that moderate listening level volume. Both systems are very clean, and the resolution capability on both seems to be about equivalent for this specific headphone. I think that this might be a limitation of this headphone and not necessarily the amplifier. Now, bass response for the 6XX actually seems a little bit stronger on the MacBook Pro compared to the Moonriver. I noted in the Moonriver review that it sounded very clean and it didn't seem to be an absolute ton of bass response. I'm not sure if this is an amperage limitation or a voltage limitation or just the tuning of this device, but it does seem to be a little bit light on bass compared to the MacBook Pro. Now, the resolution of the bass response seems about equivalent, so I like a little bit more bass, and I think a lot of people would like a little bit more bass. It's not substantial, it's just a tiny bit more on the 6XX and the MacBook Pro. But comparing the two amplifiers, the differences are not really major and definitely not worth the money in this particular case. Next up is the Topping DX5. This thing is around $380 to $400 depending on when and where you pick it up at. This is actually an area where I started noticing more substantial differences between the two amplifiers. This actually seems to have a little bit more of a mid-range tilt to the slightly warmer side over the MacBook Pro. It seemed also a little bit more forward and better separated from the background. Not substantially, just a tiny bit. This is definitely in the realm of possible placebo, but I did account for that when testing this and thought about it a lot and really compared back and forth to make sure it wasn't. I tried my best to make sure that it wasn't a placebo effect. Now, interestingly to me, which I did not anticipate, was that in the treble response, this is actually seemingly a little bit darker, and the MacBook Pro is a little bit more brilliant in the top end. So songs like Final Ascent from Hans Zimmer, the finishing like 30 seconds of that song, I actually felt was much more present and lively sounding on the 6XX than it was on the DX5. Now, this is a little bit of a good thing and a little bit of a bad thing. If you find the right song and you have the right headphone pairing, this is great. But if you find the wrong song that doesn't need any extra treble and you get a little bit of extra, that is not so great. Now, which one is considered the more of a reference? Technically, the DX5 measures a lot better. But I did notice that this seemed to be a little bit more lively in the treble response than the DX5. Another component was the three-dimensional nature of the sound staging. I felt like was a little bit better on the DX5. I'm not sure if this is purely because the imaging of the vocalist seems to be a little bit more defined, or if this is something that is actually adding to that apparent soundstage, but I did notice it was a tiny bit wider on the DX5, more out towards the edges rather than so focused kind of internally. It still had that internal focus, of course, but it seemed to be a little bit more dynamic in its range from here to a little bit further out to the side. I still am struggling to say that it's worth it though compared to the two. Like, my understanding of the music and appreciation for the headphones didn't really change given the two different amplifiers. And at this point, I'm very, very impressed with the MacBook Pro's performance so far. So this is my reference system. This system gets tested against every headphone, every other amplifier that I come in, regardless of price, just so I have like a starting point of where that review can go depending on how the performance is. This is an A90 amplifier and a D90 SE DAC. Again, way more power, not that it necessarily matters for this headphone. The most noticeable difference that I found between these two was actually the bass response. The bass response feels much more three-dimensional and full, but also like more transparent on the A90 and D90 stack. The way that I would kind of describe this is you understand the scale of large scale music a lot better. So with more EDM stuff, that's just electronic bass hits, you don't really get a ton of difference. The A90 seems a little bit thumpier, but not by much. But where you really notice it is like orchestral stuff that has like a large room environment where you need that bass to really tell you the story of the size of that room. That's where the A90 really stood out to me compared to the MacBook Pro. Again, actually, I'm starting to think that the MacBook Pro is a tiny bit bright in the top end because, again, it was a little bit brighter in the treble response than the A90. And considering how well the DX5 and the A90 measure, I'm starting to think that it shouldn't be that bright and that this is more a reference point and that this is a little bit brighter. I didn't notice a whole lot for sound staging differences besides that bass scale compared to these two specifically, but what I did really notice was the timbre of everything. Just sounded much more vibrant and a little bit more realistic. Metallic sounded more metallic, wood sounded more wooden. Everything just seemed a little bit more like flavorful and more real life on the A90 and D90. So my conclusion is honestly that I'm very impressed with the MacBook Pro's performance. I don't really think that this is one worth the money just for this headphone, like $1,000 for a $200 headphone. Probably not. Now, I think that all these amps have the benefit that the MacBook Pro does not have, which is scalability with harder to drive headphones than this, or like really big planars that need a lot of power. These can all do that, and that's where that cost benefit would come in. But as far as purely the 6XX, there are a couple amplifiers here that are legitimately better, but not necessarily worth the additional cost for the 6XX. Personally, I have absolutely no problem using the MacBook Pro as a headphone amplifier for the 6XX specifically. Also, it is notable which version of MacBook we're talking about. We are talking about this one specifically, I think is a 2021 or 2022 M1 Pro, MacBook Pro. All of the M1 Pros come with a updated headphone amplifier. So you want to make sure that you're getting the ones with the newer amplifiers, because the old legacy MacBook Pros, it kind of sucked. It wasn't nearly as good. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for watching. See you guys next time. Bye.